Picture a Victorian drawing room in London, sometime around 1870. It is, by every measure of the time, a beautiful room. The walls are covered in rich emerald green wallpaper, the most fashionable colour of the decade, the same shade Queen Victoria herself chose for Buckingham Palace. The furniture is polished mahogany. On the mantelpiece, candles burn beside ornamental figurines painted in cheerful colours. In the corner, a child plays with a set of painted lead soldiers. His mother sits nearby, sewing artificial green flowers onto a hat, her fingers stained with dye. On the side table, a bottle of laudanum, prescribed by the family doctor for her nerves. On the nursery shelf upstairs, a bottle of Godfrey's cordial, ready for when the baby won't sleep. Every single thing in this room is slowly killing someone. The wallpaper, the paint on the toys, the dye in the flowers, the laudanum, the cordial, the candles. The very air in the room, thick with particles that no one can see and no one yet understands. The Victorian age was the most innovative, most productive, most commercially confident era in British history. It gave the world the railroad, the telegraph, the photograph, mass-produced goods of every description. It gave the world the department store and the modern advertisement and the conviction that science and industry could solve every problem humanity had ever faced. And in the middle of all this confidence in the homes of the richest empire on earth, ordinary household objects were killing people by the thousands, quietly, invisibly, behind closed doors, in the most domestically comfortable rooms anyone had ever designed. This is the story of the hidden killers of the Victorian home. Hey, before we go any further, if you are into history told the way it actually felt to live it, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a like on this video. We reconstruct these stories from primary sources, eyewitness accounts and historical records. Now let's go back. To understand why the Victorian home was so lethal, you have to understand the world it existed in. The 19th century was a century without regulation. There was no Food and Drug Administration, no health and safety executive, no consumer protection legislation worthy of the name. Anyone could manufacture anything and sell it to anyone, with any claim on the label, with any ingredient inside. The ingredients didn't have to be disclosed. The doses didn't have to be tested. If your product killed people slowly enough that the connection was difficult to prove, there was essentially nothing to stop you selling it indefinitely. At the same time, Victorian England was in the grip of an industrial revolution that was producing materials, dyes, chemicals, and compounds faster than anyone understood their effects. New colors, new medicines, new building materials, new fuels, new processes that generated new byproducts that entered the air and the water and the soil and the bodies of the people who lived and worked nearby. The Victorians were not stupid people. They were not careless people. They were people living at the leading edge of a technological transformation that was moving faster than the science needed to understand it. And in that gap between innovation and understanding, people died. Let us begin where the death was most beautiful. Green. The color green, specifically a brilliant, luminous, jewel-like shade of emerald green, was the defining color of Victorian interior decoration from the 1840s through the 1880s. It appeared on wallpapers, on carpets, on curtains, on dresses, on hats, on artificial flowers, on book covers, on candles, on children's toys. It was everywhere, in every home that could afford it, which by the middle of the century meant an enormous number of homes. And it was killing everyone who lived surrounded by it. The green was made with arsenic. Specifically, it was made with Scheele's green, a pigment invented in 1775 by the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele, who combined arsenic and copper to create a color of unprecedented brilliance and durability. By the 1840s, it had been refined into an even more intense variant called Paris green or emerald green. Both pigments were extraordinarily beautiful and extraordinarily stable. The colors didn't fade, didn't run, held their intensity under gaslight as well as natural light. They were also, by modern standards, obviously and catastrophically poisonous. A single square meter of arsenic wallpaper could contain enough arsenic to kill a person several times over. The problem was not merely that the arsenic was there, it was how it got out of the walls. In damp conditions, and Victorian homes poorly ventilated and heated by coal fires that created condensation were frequently damp, a mold called Scopulariopsis brevicalis, which grew on the paste used to hang wallpaper, consumed the arsenic in the pigment and converted it into a gas called trimethylosine. This gas was colorless and nearly odorless. It drifted through the rooms of the house. People breathed it continuously, sleeping in it, working in it, living in it. The symptoms, headaches, weakness, gastrointestinal problems, skin lesions, were easily confused with other Victorian ailments. Doctors prescribed rest, change of air, tonics. The wallpaper remained on the walls. By one estimate made in the 1850s, there were 100 million square yards of arsenic-laden wallpaper in British homes. The average Victorian middle-class drawing room contained an estimated 2.5 kilograms of arsenic in its walls and furnishings. Families reported falling mysteriously ill and recovering when they went to the seaside. What they didn't understand was that they had removed themselves from the arsenic. When they came home, the symptoms returned. The most extraordinary aspect of this story is how long it took to connect the beautiful green walls to the deaths happening in the rooms they decorated. Part of the explanation is the nature of arsenic poisoning itself, which mimics many common diseases and operates slowly enough that the cause is genuinely difficult to isolate. But part of the explanation is something more uncomfortable. The people who knew about the danger often had a financial interest in not making it widely known. William Morris, the great designer, social reformer, founder of the arts and crafts movement, advocate for the rights of working people, was simultaneously one of the leading producers of arsenic wallpaper in England and a major shareholder in Devon Great Consols, one of Britain's largest arsenic mines. Morris designed some of the most beautiful and widely sold wallpapers of the Victorian era. Many of them dyed with arsenic. When concerned customers and fellow designers raised questions about the health risks, Morris dismissed them. He was well aware that arsenic was poisonous. His family had used the powder to kill rats for years. He simply chose not to apply that knowledge to his commercial products. Eventually, it was public pressure, not regulation, that ended the arsenic wallpaper industry. Consumers began demanding arsenic-free wallpapers in the 1880s and 1890s. Morris himself eventually began producing non-toxic alternatives, not out of concern for public health, but because the market demanded it. Britain never formally banned arsenic in wallpaper. The industry simply became unprofitable. Oscar Wilde, dying in a Paris hotel room in 1900, surrounded by what he considered spectacularly ugly wallpaper, is supposed to have said, "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One or the other of us has got to go." It was a joke. It was also, for thousands of Victorians, a precise description of what had happened in their homes. But arsenic in the walls was only the beginning. Arsenic was everywhere in the Victorian world, and much of it was intentional. Arsenic was used as a cosmetic. Complexion wafers, tablets sold in chemist shops under brand names like Dr. James P. Campbell's safe arsenic complexion wafers, were marketed to women who wanted paler, clearer skin. The arsenic they contained was not a side effect or a contaminant. It was the active ingredient. The theory, widely promoted by manufacturers and accepted by many doctors, was that small doses of arsenic stimulated circulation, improved the color of the skin, gave the complexion a luminous quality. Women took them daily. Some developed tolerance and took them for years. They were also over time slowly poisoning themselves. Arsenic was in the dresses. The emerald green gowns that were the height of fashion in the 1850s and 1860s were dyed with exactly the same arsenic-based pigments used in wallpaper. The British Medical Journal noted in 1862, with more wit than it perhaps intended, that a woman in an arsenic-green dress could carry enough poison in her skirts to kill all the men she danced with in an evening. This was not quite as hyperbolic as it sounds. Women who wore arsenic-dyed fabrics while dancing or exercising were sweating enough to draw the arsenic through the fabric and into their skin. Their hands turned red and cracked. Some lost their hair. Some vomited blood. And the workers who made the dresses fared far worse than the women who wore them. The artificial flower makers of London and Paris, predominantly young women working in cramped workshops, spending their days handling and dyeing arsenic-dyed materials, developed skin lesions, respiratory problems, neurological damage. One investigation in Paris in the 1860s found that the artificial flower trade was killing its workers with remarkable efficiency. The flowers were beautiful. The women who made them were dying. While arsenic was the most pervasive hidden killer, it was nowhere near the most dramatic. The Victorian match was a miracle of industrial chemistry, a small wooden stick tipped with white phosphorus that could be struck against almost any surface to produce instant fire. Strike anywhere matches they were called, and they were transformative. Before them, producing fire at home required flint and steel or a tinderbox, a slow, fiddly process that could take minutes. The match made fire instant, effortless, available to everyone. By the 1840s, millions of them were being produced every week in factories across Britain. The people producing them, predominantly young women and girls, many of them teenagers, working for wages that barely kept them alive, were developing a disease that the doctors who first saw it struggled to describe in clinical language. They called it phossy jaw. Phosphorus necrosis of the jaw began always as a toothache. Nothing dramatic. A persistent ache in the teeth or gums that didn't resolve. Then the gums swelled. Abscesses formed, the teeth began to loosen, and then, slowly and with increasing horror, the jawbone itself began to die. The necrotic tissue produced a smell so appalling that family members could not remain in the same room as the sufferer. The dead bone had to be removed surgically. In the 19th century, this meant removal of the jaw itself, a procedure performed with primitive anesthesia on patients already weakened by months of suffering. Without surgery, the necrosis spread to the skull, to the brain. The mortality rate at the Bryant and May factory, which employed hundreds of young women in London's East End, was nearly 1 in 5 for workers who developed the full disease, and the jaws of the sufferers glowed in the dark. The white phosphorus accumulating in the dead bone emitted a faint blue-green luminescence visible in darkness. Factory floors where workers handled phosphorus glowed at night. The clothes the workers wore home glowed by the fireside. The women themselves in their worst moments glowed. The disease was known. The cause was identified. The solution existed. Red phosphorus, which did not cause phossy jaw, was available and could be used to make safety matches. The only problem with red phosphorus was that it cost slightly more. The match manufacturers chose profit. European countries, Denmark in 1874, France in 1897, banned white phosphorus matches. Britain refused for decades. The workers at Bryant and May went on strike in 1888, in one of the most important labour actions of the Victorian era, organised in part by the social reformer Annie Besant. The strike attracted national attention, brought the conditions in the match factories to public notice, and eventually forced some improvements. But the ban on white phosphorus matches did not come until 1908 and did not take effect until 1910. For the workers who had spent their productive years in the glow of the phosphorus factories, it came too late. The medicines were killing people too. Victorian medicine was practiced by a profession that knew vastly less than it believed. The germ theory of disease, the understanding that infections are caused by microorganisms, was only established in the 1860s and 1870s, and it took decades to penetrate medical practice at the level of the ordinary doctor or the ordinary chemist's shop. In the meantime, millions of Victorians were treating their ailments with substances that ranged from useless to actively lethal, with no regulation requiring the contents of any bottle to be disclosed or tested. Laudanum was everywhere. It was a solution of opium dissolved in alcohol, approximately 10% opium mixed with up to 50% alcohol, and it was the aspirin of the Victorian age. You could buy it in any chemist's shop for a penny or two without a prescription, in quantities limited only by your ability to pay. Doctors prescribed it for coughs, for menstrual cramps, for rheumatism, for insomnia, for anxiety, for the vague Victorian category of complaints lumped together as women's troubles. Laudanum was given to children. It was given to babies. Godfrey's cordial, opium, water and treacle mixed into a sweet syrup, was sold specifically as a remedy for fretful infants. Teething, colic, sleeplessness, general difficulty. Working-class mothers who needed to return to their factory jobs days after childbirth, who had no one to care for their infants during the 12-hour shifts the factories demanded, gave their babies Godfrey's cordial to keep them quiet and sleeping. The babies who received it did indeed sleep. Some of them never woke up. Medical historians estimate that 3/4 of all deaths from opium poisoning in the Victorian period occurred in children under 5 years old. One 9-month-old baby is documented to have died after receiving 4 drops of laudanum over a 9-hour period. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed in Britain from the 1840s onward, was described in its advertising as a soothing syrup for children while teething. It contained morphine and ammonia. It was still on sale in 1930. A medical journal officially labeled it a baby killer in 1911. It remained on the shelf for nearly another 20 years. Mercury was prescribed for syphilis, which was epidemic in Victorian Britain, and was genuinely one of the more effective treatments available. It suppressed the disease, though it did not cure it. What it also did was destroy the kidneys, damage the nervous system, cause the teeth to fall out, and eventually, in sufficient doses, kill the patient. Many Victorians treated for syphilis with mercury died not of syphilis, but of mercury poisoning, their bodies destroyed by the cure before the disease could finish them. The black teeth visible in so many Victorian photographs are not simply the result of poor dental care. They are often the signature of mercury treatment. And then there were the patent medicines, the vast, unregulated, commercially aggressive industry of bottled remedies that promised to cure everything and were required by law to disclose nothing. Strychnine, normally used to poison rats, was sold in tiny doses as a tonic to stimulate the digestive system. Cocaine was recommended for energy and concentration, and, in a compound called coca toothache drops, for children's dental pain. Arsenic appeared in teething powders and complexion tonics. Heroin, not yet understood as addictive, was marketed as a children's cough remedy under that name by the pharmaceutical company Bayer, which had also recently invented aspirin. For most of the Victorian era, if a substance could be extracted, synthesized, or obtained cheaply enough, someone put it in a bottle and sold it as a cure. The corset was not a chemical. It was a piece of clothing. But it killed women too in its own way. The Victorian ideal of the female figure required a waist so small that it bore no relation to the natural anatomy of the adult human body. Fashion plates of the period show waists of 40 to 45 centimeters, measurements that a healthy adult woman could only achieve by compressing her internal organs with several inches of stiffened fabric and steel. The Victorian corset was an engineering achievement. It was also a slow physiological catastrophe. Tightly laced corsets displaced the liver, the stomach, the kidneys, and the intestines. They compressed the lungs, reducing breathing capacity so severely that women fainted with regularity. The fashionable Victorian tendency to swoon was not, as it has sometimes been romanticized, a manifestation of feminine delicacy. It was oxygen deprivation. Women who wore corsets through pregnancy caused damage that is difficult to comprehend. The developing fetus, competing with the rigid architecture of the corset for space, was deformed, miscarried, or born dead. Women who resumed tight lacing immediately after childbirth, as fashion demanded, suffered organ prolapse, chronic pain, and permanent internal damage. The corset industry naturally denied that any of this was happening. Their spokespersons argued that the corset actually supported the internal organs rather than damaging them. Medical opinion was divided along lines that reflected, not for the last time in history, the commercial and social interests of those expressing it. The gas that lit the Victorian home deserves its own entry in this catalogue of domestic catastrophe. Gas lighting was one of the great technological advances of the 19th century, transforming the interiors of homes and the streets of cities from the flickering uncertainty of oil lamps and candles to bright, steady, reliable illumination. By the 1850s, gas lighting was ubiquitous in middle-class British homes, installed through a network of pipes feeding from street mains into every room. It was clean compared to candles, far brighter, and when it worked beautifully. When it didn't work, the consequences were extreme. Gas pipes leaked, gas jets blew out in drafts without shutting off the supply, gas accumulated in enclosed rooms. Carbon monoxide, produced by the incomplete combustion of gas in poorly maintained fittings, was colourless and odourless and killed without warning. Victorian households were periodically found dead in their beds, the gas having leaked overnight to fill the room while everyone slept. Unlit gas jets were used for suicides, with a regularity that required no particular medical knowledge. You simply turned the tap and waited. And the sewers, which we have already learned about separately, could turn a Victorian bathroom into an execution chamber. Methane and hydrogen sulfide, building up in the sewage pipes beneath the bathroom floor, could be ignited by the open flame of a gas jet. Victorian bathrooms occasionally exploded. The baby bottle, known to later generations with a kind of horrified affection as the murder bottle, was perhaps the most tragically ironic item in this catalogue. The long tube feeding bottle, a glass reservoir attached to a long rubber tube with a teat at the end, designed to allow mothers to prop the bottle against a cushion and leave the baby to feed itself, was celebrated as a modern convenience when it appeared in the mid-19th century. It was sold in every pharmacy. Doctors recommended it. The rubber tube, which was essentially impossible to clean properly and which filled with warm milk and sat at room temperature for hours between feedings, was an ideal medium for bacterial growth. Infants fed from murder bottles developed diarrhea, then dehydration, then died. The connection between the bottle and the infant deaths was understood by some doctors from quite early on, but the bottle remained on sale and in use until public health campaigns of the late Victorian and Edwardian periods finally drove it from the market. What connects all of these killers, the arsenic in the walls, the phosphorus in the matches, the opium in the baby's bottle, the mercury in the syphilis treatment, the compressed organs in the corset, the leaking gas in the bedroom, is not stupidity. The Victorians were not stupid people. What connects them is the peculiar blindness that comes from living inside a system. The arsenic wallpaper was beautiful, and Queen Victoria had it in Buckingham Palace. The laudanum worked. It did reduce pain. It did produce sleep. It did quiet crying infants. The match factories were employing thousands of women who had no other work. The corset was what women wore. The gas was better than the alternative. The baby bottle was more convenient than constant nursing. Every single one of these killers was embedded in a web of commerce. Fashion, convenience, and social norm that made questioning them feel eccentric, excessive, unnecessary. The Victorians were the first modern consumers, the first people to live surrounded by mass-produced, commercially distributed goods in the quantities that we would recognize today. And they discovered at enormous cost what every subsequent generation has had to rediscover: that the people producing those goods are primarily motivated by profit, that profit and safety are not naturally aligned, and that the burden of proving something dangerous tends to fall on the dead rather than on those who sold it to them. Germany banned arsenic in wallpaper. France banned white phosphorus in matches. Britain waited. The market eventually did most of the work. Consumers stopped buying arsenic wallpaper when they understood it was killing them, and manufacturers stopped producing it because it became unprofitable. This is one way a problem gets solved. It is not the fastest way, and the people who died while the market was working things out had no particular interest in the efficiency of the process. The drawing room is empty now. The emerald green wallpaper has come down. The lead-painted soldiers have been thrown away. The bottle of laudanum is gone from the side table. The murder bottle is in a museum. The corset is in a glass case. And somewhere under the streets, the Victorian sewers that Joseph Bazalgette built are still running, carrying away everything the city no longer needs, outlasting everything that tried to kill the people who lived above them.